we asked Dave Neal to come and talk with us. He's a former rec director, and we've asked him to come and talk to us. I think he's sleeping over there. Maybe. Dave, can you come up and sit with us for a moment? Okay.
I never sleep.
Hey, while you're at it,
I know.
It's been a while since I've sat at
I know.
a rec advisory board meeting.
Right.
Welcome.
Welcome. I think you missed introductions. If you'd like us to do it again, we're happy to. It's all right? Okay. This is the first time I've met you, and happy to meet you. We have a few questions for you. What was your experience like? What did you do at Recreation? What do you do now? And what was your experience like here?
Sure. Let me just give you a little background so you know why I came. For the last 17 years, I've been teaching at Summit Street, kindergarten, first grade, mostly. Some second grade for a while. Second grade, right? Yeah. And but for 17 years prior to that, I was a community recreation director. I served in 4 different communities, 2 in Pennsylvania, 2 here in Vermont, in all governance areas. My first job in Pennsylvania was in Mount Lebanon, a suburb of Pittsburgh, pretty large community. Mm-hmm. I was the number 3 guy in that department, and my title was Recreation Supervisor. We were a municipal recreation and parks department. Pretty large suburb, pretty affluent suburb. We had some really nice facilities, pretty centrally located, and then had a pretty big community around us. It was my introduction into, being a recreation professional, and, in terms of municipal governance, it was great. The things that I learned fairly quickly there were that, there was a period of time where the facilities that we had and that we managed as municipal, were fairly limited. A huge piece of what we did happened on school property, in school buildings, using school equipment, using school resources, all those kinds of things. So it was one of those things as a young professional, I always used to think, man, we got a pretty good deal going here, and that we're a municipal government, and we answered to a town manager, and things were pretty good. But again, the piece of it is we had a year-round ice rink, we had an outdoor swimming pool, we had clay tennis courts. We hosted the National Amateur Clay Championships every year in the summer, a big-time tennis center. We had a variety of those things, but still, and I've said it to Brad before, that's when I really learned, our summers were our most visible times, but our school years were our busiest times. You just didn't see it because it wasn't out on display. I left there after a few years and got a job as a recreation director. I had that itching. I had to run my own department. So went out and got a job as a recreation director in a very, very different governance setup. And I beg a little bit of naivety here, and I haven't, I follow what happens here, obviously, because I have some real vested interests, and you guys do the summer concert series. I pop in there every once in a while because that's one of my babies. Yeah. The Halloween party was one of my babies.
Oh, awesome.
There's a lot of things that I keep tabs on a regular basis because those were things that started when I was here. So I have an interest in there, but I don't, get into the nitty-gritty politics all the time. One, because, I promised the director that followed me. It's very rare that a recreation director leaves a job but stays in a community. So the first one that came, when Denise first came, I, kind of said, when you need me, you call me. And other than that, I'm just a resident of Cascade Street. So, I and Brad and I happened to have a conversation, so we started talking. My second job was a really unique job in that it was a nonprofit. It was an infant. I got it started. It was one in which we had 3 municipal governments and a school district who went together, couldn't do a recreation department, any entity by themselves, and decided that, a nonprofit organization in which they all contributed at some ratio level was the one chance for them to have a recreation department. So I took that job on as a director, and in some respects, had, as you guys all sit here and flush all this kind of stuff out, had some of the best of both worlds. My office was in the school district administration building. On a day-to-day basis, my recreation board at that point was policy making. They weren't advisory, they were policy making. So when we had a monthly meeting, decisions made there, that was it. But because we couldn't always get the 7 members of those together, they actually set up and made a decision that I would answer directly to the superintendent of schools if there were ever that decision that needed to be made today. Can't get everybody on the phone, can't get a consensus, okay, they agreed, his call. So we had representatives of the 3 municipalities in the school district all on that rec board. And, I used municipal facilities. Each municipality had its own little parks and things like that, so we used those. But again, we had the benefit of, now I had schools, and I had a pretty direct access to schools. I was able to get a policy written fairly quickly that said, school activities 1, recreation activities 2. So if it wasn't a direct school function, I had pretty easy access to going and using school facilities, using school equipment, using school people at times when I needed school people. So worked that community a little while, and then, we decided we need a little adventure, so we thought we'd temporarily, a few years come to Vermont, and I wound up in Woodstock, Vermont, and was the recreation director there for a little over 6 years. Again, a nonprofit, not affiliated with either, got some funds from the village and towns of Woodstock, and consequently had an appointed board member to, again, a policy-making recreation board. And, had, again, a pretty good reign on, I could use someone comfortable with the school people and build up a level of trust, which had not been there when I got there. It was a department that had been in existence for a while, had several directors. Not necessarily great relationships with the schools. So the schools were often very hesitant to let us use things. But again, 9 months out of the year here in Vermont, for sure, you're not doing a whole lot of recreation if you're not in school buildings. I mean, those are the community centers. Like it or not, that becomes the community center. So, we set out fairly quickly to become good friends with the schools. Was able to work that out relatively early in my recreation career in Woodstock, and then enjoyed for a number of years that idea of, a phone call to a principal, a phone call to a superintendent, or whomever to arrange for getting in the schools. When the job here in Essex Junction came open, it was one of those ones in which, we'd always thought that if there was one place in Vermont we'd move, because we thought we'd be moving back to Pennsylvania. We thought that there was one job in Vermont that we would come to. It was Essex Junction. I knew George at the time. George had been the only director here in Essex Junction for, its first 21 or 24, whatever it was, years of existence. And so I had known George. 1970. 1970. So, I
Dunbar, excuse me, George
Gamble. George
Okay,
Gamble.
okay.
And, George and I had gone to a few conferences together, national conferences and things like that, so I'd gotten to know him pretty well. And I'd known Darrell Lovelet, who was in Essex Town, for a number of years, and we had become very close. So, as we were involved in the state organization and stuff like that, I knew a lot about Essex, at least in terms of recreation-wise. And it was one of those things, again, that was somewhat attractive to me because it went back to that dairy idea of, a direct relationship to schools. Because, when I was in dairy, a piece that I had that I didn't have completely here was the school district, when they were part of that nonprofit, some of the things I did for them, I ran all the intramurals. I ran all the adult education programs. I ran a lot of the middle school athletics and things. It was just a way for them to get some of those things, which were, often tough for that assistant principal to have as a second job and title, into a place where somebody could focus more on those. So, I just thought, I looked at this one and thought, okay, this is a pretty good deal. And I got here, to find out some of the things that had happened at that time. And actually, there was one of the first governance issues that was involved here. When I showed up, it was, the school get out of it. The school board at that time, had a very strong feeling that they weren't sure they wanted to be involved in recreation at all, and actually were gonna not turn it over to the village, but go to the town. One department, all of Essex, and it was gonna be with the town. So I kinda took that job with the idea of a few folks saying, nah, don't worry about that, that's not gonna happen. And a few folks saying, well, it's a real possibility. So, I came up here and it didn't work out that way. At the time, when I came, I didn't have an advisory board. There was no advisory board here. So my entire 5.5, 6 years as the recreation director in Essex Junction, I reported directly to, at that time, business manager Roger Derby, and also Bob Harrison, who was the superintendent of schools. When I needed big decisions made, I was on the agenda at the school board. So I just didn't have an advisory committee at that point in time. There had been one. It had been disbanded, as they had disbanded, the school had disbanded a variety of advisory type committees. So, for my time here, it was pretty much a one horse show. Me and Jackie Barnes, God bless her, was an incredible administrative assistant, and then we did things with a lot of part-time people. And over the years, I think I go back to one of the greatest assets where we had Maple Street Park, we had Cascade Park, we had Stevens Park. All, cool little places that had things that they offered to different parts of the communities. But really, the brunt of what we did, September to end of May, was done in the community centers of Essex Junction, Hiawatha, Summit, Cascade, ADL, and the high school. So for me, it was one of those things that it was, it was the kind of the right place to be, because again, we were able to set up those kinds of connections in which, it was a phone call or a drop in the office to say, I need this tonight. Can we do that? And certainly, that because I had that ability to, I sat in other administrative meetings with, superintendent of schools, and that, I was part of that administrative team, so I sat in meetings like that, and we had conversations, and those things got established, those relationships got established. It was just about at the end of my tenure as the recreation director when that governance issue came up again. This time it came up as school district village. The school board at that time, again, was made up of some folks who, who there was a lot of things going on. The IBM taxation things had begun to change. There were some worries about, can the school district, handle a variety of stuff, and recreation got to be one of those things that got tossed on the table. How are we gonna, can we justify still being in the recreation business, and do all the other things that we needed to do. And, certainly at that point in my juncture, being here, again, I would guess that it was probably in the 5-year range when that came up for me. I took the position of, if it isn't broke, what are we tinkering for? It was, things worked well. Village manager at the time and I had a great relationship, so if there were things that we needed to do municipal-wise, we went in and got a grant. That's when we did some work on the bathhouse at the pool. We did some renovations at Maple Street Park. We did some renovations at both Cascade and Stevens. And so at the time, it was built again, and we worked very closely together on those applications, because again, they were the property owner and we were the governing agency. By governing, I mean the day-to-day operations agency. And so we worked those things out, and it just, it just seemed to fit right. I just didn't have any of those issues in which, when I needed an answer to something, I didn't have somebody whose ear was there relatively immediately to say, let's talk about this. So it really worked well for me. And again, a tremendous amount of what we did in school buildings. you know, even to the majority of the summer things in those days, we called them playgrounds, but there was a playground at Hiawatha, there was a playground at ADL, there was a younger kids playground at Summit, there was a playground at Fleming. You know, so our summer activities were pretty much located in schools because there was never a rain issue. You had the gyms, you had the cafeterias, you had those facilities to get right into. And, you know, I always kind of felt at that time that if there was, you know, if there was something, if something happened, I'm sitting at that table with those guys to deal with whatever happened. We break a window, we do this, whatever. You know, it wasn't one of those things of, oh, the rec department, because I've felt that at different times in my career, in different places under different governance. So, you know, again, I took that position at that particular time just about that, you know, I thought it was a great arrangement. Everybody seemed to really work well together. You know, we didn't have a lot of different players that, you know, had a different suggestion that seemed to make more sense. So, so that was my, you know, my take at it at that particular time. You know, you sit back down now and you know, I'm out of it. I'm not out of it. The old, you know, the recreation directors that have been around for a while started a thing when I first came here called the Champlain Valley Recreation Association, and you know, and some of those folks that were original members of that thing with me, we get together 4 or 5 times a year, and you know, and we talk, and several of them are still active in the recreation business. You've hired one as a Betsy Orsolay and I were going to do that consulting business together there. It was, you know, one of those things we thought we'd do, and I'm just so busy. I never got part of that. But you know, Betsy and I and Timmy Smith and Tommy Hubbard and Maggie Lugers and those guys, we still get together, you know, and we exchange ideas and pick brains and all that kind of stuff on a, you know, pretty regular basis. We were all together back in September, and you know, one of the things they asked me about, you know, what's your opinion on that? And you know, so obviously I have some, and you know, so we talk some of that kind of stuff. But you know, and as we talk about that with those recreation directors from the immediate area who have some similar kinds of things, and they also have some similar kind of, you know, there's some of them, they're municipal, there's, you know, there's some nonprofits, you know, they all have issues. There's all issues. There's issues with, you know, trying to get this done sometimes. There's issues with, you know, trying to get into a school if you're municipal. There's issues with all those kinds of things. You know, and I think those are the things that, you know, why you need to really discuss them and talk them out. I mean, you know, there are a lot of recreation departments around the state that I sat at and helped get started. Windsor, Sherburne, Shelburne, Williston, Heinsberg. You know, all those at the beginning, I would go, George Plum at the time was the guy with the state recreation department. They kind of disbanded that, but George was a guy who was at the state level, and part of his job was to seed departments and grow recreation in the state of Vermont. And I was his traveling buddy at many places that was thinking about, you know, recreation, and often we sat at this tables like this and had this discussion, and you know, and as they do the inventories of what they had in town, you know, I'd throw out the ideas of why municipal might be right, or why school might be right, or why my nonprofit might be right. Mm-hmm. You know, and a number of those went in different directions. You know, because of the things that were right for them in their communities. So, you know, as we sit here, it's you know, there's reasons, as in any discussion, there's reasons why this is the right thing to do and why that one's the right thing to do. You know, and so
If I could ask a question about when you worked in departments that were municipally run, did you find there was more complication in relation to how you used the school facilities? Was it less easy or more than when you worked with the, you know, you worked with schools?
In Mount Lebanon, suburb of Pittsburgh, was the one I worked at that was completely, truly municipal. recreation is not unlike schools, is not unlike a lot of things in that, the single biggest thing you do is people. When I got to Mount Lebanon, the individual that had had my job before me, was one of those recreation people that wasn't a great people person. So when I went to a lot of schools to ask about using this for this and that for that, I got a lot of cold shoulders to start with. So there were some barriers I had to work on, because you say you're going to get out at this time and you don't. You say you're going to do this and you don't. We're not going to use that equipment, and then you get there and that equipment's not there, and so you borrow it and you use it and something happens. So we had some fences to mend when I got there. That's, for those of you that know me well enough, that's, doesn't happen with me. So when I got there, I mended a variety of fences, and so for the person that followed me, their relationships with the school were much easier. It was much easier for them to walk into a principal's office and say, hey, I'm here, I'm the recreation supervisor, how are you? I'd like to use this gym on that day. So there was a much greater level of trust at that time. The answer to that question is often directed in the business that we're in. But, I think in both, in two of my departments, I wasn't directly associated with schools. Two of my departments, I had somewhat of a direct association with schools. Certainly the two in which I had some direct relationship with schools, it was just a more natural fit. And those other two, it took work.
Yeah.
It took work.
That's great historical synopsis. Thanks a lot. Do anybody have a question here or in the audience? I forgot to say, I can't see everyone, but holler if you do. Dave is here, he's a font of wisdom about this particular recreation department.
It's a great history.
Yeah, it is good, isn't it? Fun.
So you came, when did you come to Essex Junction, 70?
To Essex Junction?
Yeah.
No.
After.
I came to Essex Junction in September of 1989.
Okay.
And you were here until then?
I think 94. In 94, I believe I took the half-time kindergarten job. So I was a half-time recreation director and a half-time
That's right.
kindergarten teacher.
And George was hired in 1970 and stayed until 89?
Yeah.
Wow.
George was the only
That's unbelievable.
director, when I came. Yeah.
I have a question for you. If you were going to compare, I know Bridget brought up the comparison between when you were operating the rec program for the schools or by municipality directly. If you were going to be going out and to compare, is it apples and oranges? I mean, is there any true way that you really can go out and compare recreation programs in Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Vermont, wherever, what have you? I mean, it seems to me that every community is going to have a different setup, unique to their citizens, their citizens. Some communities are older communities and they don't have as many kids, so it'd be obviously be targeted more towards them. So I just wonder how you view that as far as right now, as you're aware of what's going on with the governance issue here, and discussion by trustees about having a consultant go out and look at other rec programs around the area, state, where, what have you, and use that as a basis of whether we should change the rec program here, governance here. And I liken that almost to somebody looking at what an individual drives for a car. If I drive an old 1980 Jeep Cherokee, and and the guy in the neighborhood, the next community, the neighborhood over, whatever, drives a brand new Cadillac Escalade, he's able to do just as much as I can do at a greater expense with a lot more luxuries, the amenities that are there, but it's apples and oranges. You can't. It depends on what you do, right? Is that, am I off or am I?
I would go back to what I'd said a little bit about, departments. And again, ones that I was there, when the meetings were, hey, we think we want to have a recreation department, but we're not sure what we're going to do. And I'd go with George Plum, and we'd sit down, and there was often 5, 6, 7, 8 year meetings to try to do that. And the piece that I'd always talked with them about is, one, you got to know what your community is. What resources do you have in your community? And what direction do you want to go? Sherburne, Vermont, Killington. Okay? When I went up to the top of the mountain from Woodstock to Sherburne for, meetings in the cold winter nights, and I'd be thinking about, okay, when they ask me this question, what's the answer to this question? When I get up there, and they ask me, well, we want to do this, is there a concrete answer? It's hard to have concrete answers. We're talking about people. The business is people. If all we're talking about here is maintenance of parks, then sit back and let's see who's more efficient in maintenance, school district or the village. And let's check that out. And again, that's a subjective, that's going to be subjective. I walk to school from Cascade every day. I mean, when I walked up Park Street, the sidewalks had already been plowed. I walked about 7 o'clock in the morning. When I walked up Park Street, the sidewalks had already been plowed, but so had the parking lots. So when I got to the Domino's place, somebody had pushed all the snow, so the Domino's parking lot was now clean, but you couldn't go over the sidewalk because it was piled high snow there. So if you're walking through there, you say, Village doesn't do a very good job taking care of sidewalks here, do they? All right, because I couldn't go through that, and here's traffic coming on Park Street, and there's nowhere really to go without going in snow. So if I'm trying to not go in snow. So, to me, it's all that subjective part of how do you want to compare this? So if we were doing parks, we could, if that's what you're really talking about, I guess you could come out and come up with something to quantify number of complaints over a period of year on how people take care of things. But that's not what you're really talking about. That's a small piece of what this department's all about. The piece that this department's all about is people and what you do for people on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on a seasonal basis, right? And so for me, you got to sit back and you got to do some inventories around that, and how do you serve that the most efficient? And again, when I was in Sherburne, talking to them about that group of people that were anxious to get a recreation department going, and how are we going to do this? And as we sat down there, Sherburne itself, municipally, had a pool that had been in existence for a while, right? And then they had some places that they leased because there's a lot of recreation on Killington Mountain, right? But they didn't really own very much. They had an elementary school because their kids went to Woodstock for high school. So they didn't, they had one not so big elementary school, had a nice little gym in it. So as they tried to figure out what they were going to do, I spent a lot of time saying to them, your inventory kind of leads you towards schools. That's where they started thinking about that might be the best fit for them. School district, ultimately, because it was one of those giant supervisory unions. Superintendent sat in Pomfret, Vermont, a 45-minute drive from Sherburne. They ultimately decided, nah, we're going to stay municipal. Okay? And over the years of them being in existence, that served them well. Windsor, Windsor was a little bit the opposite. Windsor was, they had a lot of land. They didn't have anything on any of it. So when they were going to start, they were going to be a school-driven department, because playgrounds were going to be on school, because that's the only place they had where kids could play. They had the pond when you go over the highway and the river comes down and empties into the little pond area there. They had the pond, which was municipally owned. That was their swimming area. Great place to have a swim meet. And so they originally leaned towards going with the school because that's where their decision led them to go. I believe since then they've gone to being a municipal department, only because when the school got in such a bad place, I used to referee basketball. I'd walk in there to do a basketball game and get the broom out to sweep the floor because their school had gotten pretty nasty. And they got to that point where they needed to really focus on what's happening in the school and they built a new high school, and that took a considerable amount of energy, and in the process of that energy being expended on that, the municipality stepped in and took over the Windsor Department. So, you know, it's one of those things where I don't know, is there an easy answer? You know, is it as easy as you use the car analogy, you know? When Kathy and I sit down to buy a car, we have that, you know, boom, 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 and we fill in the boxes, whichever the most boxes has checks in it, we go. You know, is that what happens here? I don't know. I think when I sit back as a resident, you know, when I sit back as a resident and think about it, and now my kids are 24 and 20, so they're not using recreation facilities a lot. I look out over Cascade Park every morning when I wake up. Cascade Park's is my front yard. You know, I always tell people, you know, I just appear rich because I have tennis courts in the front yard. You know, when I look out over Cascade Park, so obviously I have a vested interest all the time because, you know, one night, one of the maintenance guys came through at about midnight emptying garbage. I see the lights out there, you know, my radar goes off immediately. Somebody's vandalizing the park. Man, I'm out the garage door down there. Finally, I say, boy, they're vandalizing the park by emptying garbage. So, you know, I go back in the house and watch a little bit longer, and so somebody was out there at about midnight emptying garbage in Cascade Park. You know, so, but when I sit back, I guess the piece that I really think about as a taxpayer and somebody who's still here is, if you change governance, you know, what are the initial changes that you're thinking about making in stuff? You know, and if you're making initial changes in stuff, you gotta explain to me why. I mean, you know, I don't know. I haven't sat in the director's chair in a long time. I don't know, you know, if the changes are that Brad can't get answers from a superior for him to be able to pull the trigger when he needs to pull the trigger and do things, then maybe there's a change in governance. He has to answer that question. I don't know the answer to that question. I know that when I needed an answer to a question here from a superior and I needed an answer now, I never had a problem. Roger Derby's phone, when I called, he answered. So that was never an issue for me here when I was the director. You know, so did I have access to the answers I needed and the people I needed when I needed it to happen? I did. You know, will that happen in a municipality? I don't know. I spent a lot of time, you know, over the years, one of my field trips has always been to the wastewater treatment plant and to the power dam and all that. I've always taken kids down there. And every time, and so I've got to know Jim Chetras well, right? And I mean, every time I ever talk to Jim, you know, he has, in a variety of managers, has always felt very comfortable that he gets an answer from a manager. So does that change in governance? I don't know. I mean, that would be a question I would ask. What's the availability of the guy I need when I need him? You know, what's the availability of, if the guy or gal can't make the answer that I need when I need it, what's the availability of the next group that can? How soon can I get to the trustees and get them to make an answer? How soon can I get to the school board to get them to make an answer? Because those are the things that ultimately affect how we operate day to day. You know, because everybody has somebody that they got to answer to. How does that, where do we go from? So I think, you know, that's one of those things that we got to sit back and, you know, and obviously if we're volleying over the net for governance and we're both want it, we're both answering those questions well, somewhere along the line somebody's got to make a subjective call, right?
Sounds like it's, in my opinion, it sounds like if it's going to be a subjective call, it should be put on a ballot. Let the citizens of this community make it as a whole, as opposed to a 6-member board, whether it's our board, the trustees board, or any board in this community. Let the citizens as a whole make that decision.
Okay.
Your experience both as an educator and as a recreation director, talk to me about the difference in mission that you've experienced when the recreation department has been affiliated with schools as opposed to the municipal government. It seems to me that there's a large conflict in the recreation department with education, both with adults and with kids, and that
And that, again, to me, you hit a great nail on the head. The focus of this department, at least in the years that I had my hand on the rudder, we worked hard to make sure that adults were involved. You know, the adult education program, we were doing anywhere from 20 to 30, sometimes 35 classes in the fall, that many in the spring. We were trying to, because ultimately, you know, with the adults in Vermont in particular with town meeting, the adults hold that purse string. So I made it a very strong part of our mission that we were going to make sure that we had adult things. So, you know, we did start adult volleyball. We started some of those things that had not been here to do. Same time, thought about those family things, which is why we started the park series, the 4th of July, brought that back. You know, the Halloween thing, a variety of those things that had families coming together to do things. So that, again, we were connecting adults and kids. But the bottom line of just about every recreation department in America, in the world for that matter, is the focus is taking care of kids. Taking care of kids in places that and times when they're not taken care of. And as we've gone and changed as a society, certainly that has become an even bigger emphasis. So the answer to your question is, in the two departments where I was directly affiliated with schools, the recreation department's, you know, mission statements weren't as big a deal in the 70s and the 80s and the beginning of the 90s as they tend to be now. But certainly our mission was, you know, that we were going to do right by kids. And the training was dramatically different when I was associated with schools than when I was associated with municipal departments. One, because we looked at it differently, right? And we had different connections. You know, things are in place. How does it change? But right now, there's an after-school program at Summit. My room's across the hall from the gym. When I hear that familiar scream in that room, I'm generally through the doors to see what's going on, because it's one of the kids from my classroom. You know, and I'm going in there and, you know, and having a conversation, just, hey, you know, what's going on? Most of the kids that work there are kids that I know from either, again, Summit Street, coaching them, neighbor kids, whatever. So, you know, there's a lot of connections, and we talk about, you know, hey, this one had a bad day today. How do you do this? How do you do that? Now, will that change? We have an established relationship. Well, is that established relationship going to change because it's municipal or it stays? I guess if it's a clean sweep, you know, and there's all new people in charge of things, maybe. But I'm assuming that's not one of the first criteria of that. You know, if it changes things, all jobs are open and we have to start all over again. So I think that, you know, when you start at a zero place and you build, you have schools' missions are more children-oriented and whatnot, by nature, by law. So if we were to start this department from zero, and that was our real focus, and I was sitting here and we were talking about inventories and how to best meet those inventories, and kids were our primary focus, I'd be saying, man, if we have the option, we want to be affiliated with school. Because school's gonna, you know, give us those resources, give us those insights, give us those opportunities to do it if we're starting at scratch, ground zero. Okay? If our focus is, you know, facilities, and I'm sitting back and I'm looking at schools, you know, schools got to take care of schools. I mean, I won't lie to you, when I was the recreation director here, if those of you were in this community back then, you saw me riding tractors through towns an awful lot. Because, you know, school, during the course of the day, got done what they could get done, and if that Little League field at Cascade Park wasn't ready for a game that night, I was on that tractor going over there, getting that infield ready, and it was ready by the time Brad showed up as a 12-year-old to play Little League baseball. All right? So, you know, if we're talking about facilities, I'm being, you know, completely honest. If you know me, that's where I live. I'm being completely honest, in my 5 years here, maintenance-wise, school district, it was not the best place to be. Because I did a lot of maintenance on my own, all right? Or with parts of my family coming to help me do maintenance around here. Because we had a small summer crew, but the rest of the time, if it was leaf raking time in the spring, you could find Bruce Murdo and I, because, I'd help him close down the rink, and he'd help me open up Maple Street Park. So, if we were starting at ground zero, I would say, that was not the focus of the schools, was to take care of parks. They took care of grounds on the schools, which was a big deal. All right? So, I'm giving you great answers. Right on the fence.
Harlan won't let me drive the tractor, so.
No, he's not allowed to drive the tractors.
Well, I took care of that
Leave
old
Harlan out.
47 beast for a long time.
I got a quick question for you. You'd mentioned that the Windsor Rec Department had changed from municipal to,
School to municipal, as
school
far
to
as I,
municipal.
as far as I know, yes.
as far, oh, okay, so how many of those transitions have you been a part of personally? It sounds like you've been,
I've been a part of the startups. Once
Okay.
they start up, they were on their own.
okay, okay, all right,
I mean, my job, not unlike now as a teacher.
right.
When another teacher comes around and needs help,
Mhm.
I believe it's my job to get in there and give them a hand.
Yep.
Something they need to do.
Mhm.
When I was a recreation director, somebody looking to start this, I still believe recreation is an incredible resource for any community.
Mhm.
So if there was a community that didn't have it,
Yep.
and they needed a hand, and it meant a night a month for me to go with somebody to go and sell that idea, I was in.
Okay.
So, I helped start a lot of them. But once they
Okay.
got going and they put somebody on staff and started paying them to take care of it, which I was a part of a lot of those hiring committees.
Mhm.
Once they got to that process, call me and ask me a question, yeah, but
Okay.
I wasn't going back to monthly meetings.
More,
I had enough of my own.
startup.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Thanks, Dave. The history is really interesting, and I really like your vantage point. I'd love to have you back sometime.
If I were to leave you with anything, and you guys are the rec advisory committee, and my sense is that, what you want is the best. You want what is the best for this community, from 0 to 90,
That's right.
for the facilities, for every piece of it. As do the trustees, as does the school district, and we all know that the tax money is our tax money.
Right.
It's, all those things are right there. So, there's no easy answer. The question's gonna come down to, really, what, is there one thing that really stirs it? I don't see it. But,
I like your quote,
Could be.
Dave. If I could quote you at some point, you had said the single biggest thing you do is people, and I love that. Thank you,
so much.
Dave. Thank you
Thanks,
for your
Dave.
time.